All right. Let's get one thing out of the way right. Oh, hang on. Got to do the thing. We here at the Lorerunner of our Shingaya wish to talk about Zelda games. And what? Okay, I'm done. I'm done. Okay. I only have about a page of notes here because there's not much to talk about, but there are a few things I really want to cover. But the first thing I want to cover right off the bat, smack dab, is why it is I'm only doing one video instead of two. It's like this. If you asked me some of my favorite movies of all time, I'd say Star Wars and Lord of the Rings and a bunch of others I'm not going to list here. In other words, all three Star Wars original trilogy in my mind, counts as one movie. All three of the the Lord of the Rings trilogy counts as one movie. You take out a piece and it's lacking, so it's the whole thing, right? I feel the same generalized way about the Oracle's games. It's actually funny because some people, one of the questions I get asked semi-frequently about this series is, which one do you like best? And my response is always, Usually when I think of them, I mentally group them together, so it never even occurs to me to prefer one over the other. So that's why we're doing one video, but especially after having replayed this and looking into some of the behind-the-scenes stuff, it makes a lot of sense. So, for those of you not aware, Oracle of Ages, Oracle of Seasons, and Minish Cap were all made by Capcom, the same team, actually. Plus or minus a few people. Same development studio at the very least. And with the same head involved. And it all started when one of the gentlemen involved wanted to go back and do a remake. And from all intents, we don't have a lot of information, but based on what we're hearing, it sounds like they wanted to do a proper remake of Zelda 1 and Zelda 2, so that the more modern people could enjoy them. I find this idea fascinating because we've never actually had a proper remake of Zelda 1 and Zelda 2. We've had ports, and we've had the Oracle's games, and if you've played Oracle of Seasons, you could probably see how some of that remake fits in there, because a lot of the dungeons and enemies and boss designs and some of the overall layout and design of the game really does feel like a proper remake of Zelda 1 in many ways. I especially like what they did with Dodongo, for example. But anyways, that kind of fell apart, and there's no nice way to say this, because of bad planning. Put simply, they were doing things in the wrong order. I don't want to get too much into details. They were doing things in the wrong order, and as a result of doing so, they kept having to redo things and redo things, and about a year passed, with fully funded, with zero outcome. They hadn't produced anything yet after a full year. Now, of course, a year is both a large and a small amount of time when it comes to game design, but they should have produced something by that point in time. Now, the great thing about this is Miyamoto got involved slightly, and say what you like about the man, but the man is a gamer and a developer first. And he was like, okay, look, why don't you take it in another direction? We don't want to pull the plug on your project. Why don't you go ahead and push in another direction? Why don't you go do something else with it? And so the idea came to be of them doing 3 games. Now, I know you've all heard about the 3 games idea, but I'm not sure how many of you have heard what the idea was. 3 completely different styles of gameplay in each of these games. This is funny because anybody who caught my stream when we were talking about our hopes and wishes for the new Zelda game, not the 3DS one, the Wii U one, one of my biggest things that I would love is the ability to play as 3 different people. Again, the most obvious answer to that would be Zelda, Link, and Ganon, or some equivalent thereof. But be able to play as 3D people and have the playstyle be so fundamentally different. Same world, right? Same general terrain, and this would be insane to design, but is possible. It would just take time and effort, and a lot of creativity, to design it in a way so that the person with wisdom, whoever it ends up being, the individuals don't matter, but the person with wisdom tries to outthink, to dodge, to bypass, to generally not just fight their way through things, but to maneuver their way through things, right? The person with courage would probably be the closest to your standard Zelda setup. Lots of tools, lots of gadgets, lots of things that give you a great deal of versatility. And of course, then the one with power would be able to literally destroy things that are in their path. I mean, like obstacles, traps, and of course enemies and bosses. And there would probably be more enemies in general along, and more difficult enemies along the paths that would be opened up by Power's movements. So three different complete. So you see how this ties in here, because that was the intention with the original three games. There was going to be a, I forget what they call it. But it was like the seed of wisdom and the seed of courage. The courage one was going to be basically a standard Zelda game. The power one was, I've already just described it. Mind you, I didn't know that the Oracle's games were originally going to be this when I put forth that idea. It's just an idea that seemed a natural outgrowth of the series to me. And I stand by that statement, and that's probably why they had the idea too. When Capcom was looking at this, they were like, well, why don't we do three different types of game style? Now that fell apart due to time and money concerns, as ever. So they kind of hacked and slashed and chopped, and what we have is Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons. Given the fact that these are literally Frankenstein games, I'm amazed they're as good as they are. Let me get this out of the right way. If you haven't been able to tell yet, the intro I put to these ruminations is kind of a hint of how good the game is, I think, that I'm looking at. Feel free to try and figure that out on your own time. But the point is, I do like these games. I do genuinely enjoy the Oracle's games quite a lot. But they really are Frankenstein games, because there's bits and pieces of the original proper remake in there, as I've already mentioned. There's bits and pieces of the intention for things to be more puzzly. I'll talk about that in a moment. And there's bits and pieces of the more combat focus too. And so it's just, it's literally a mesh of 4 different gameplay ideas pushed into 2 games. But I think they pulled it off pretty well. That being said, let's go ahead and let's talk about a few lore stuff first. I know that sounds weird, but I have less to say lore-wise than gameplay-wise for this series, for these 2 games. So here's a question. Why did Link go seek out the Triforce in order to and lead to these adventures? Now, for those of you not aware, this happens pretty much immediately after Link to the Past. It is implied within a year or 2 after Link to the Past. I don't believe it's ever been put down absolutely. Seasons happens first, then Ages. But in both cases, he goes and seeks out the Triforce, and the Triforce says, go over here and save this place. Now, based on what I said in LTTP and based on my own theories on the matter, I believe that, peace is still in Hyrule, and indeed will be for as long as this Link is alive. Hence, why the Triforce, why Link, when he went to the Triforce, was given another mission, because the Triforce knew the wish in his heart, so to speak. He didn't actually touch the Triforce to make that wish granted, because his wish was still being granted. But the Triforce knew you want to help save more people in other places, and therefore sent him to these other realms. Now, here's a question. Before we even analyze that question, are these other dimensions or other locations? Debatable, heavily debatable. If you asked me my opinion, I'd say other locations. This is a planet, after all, and planets are big things. Hyrule may be a large chunk of terrain, but there's plenty of other locations that could be on there. And the fact that they've even heard of Hyrule kind of further adds fuel to that particular fire. But I've heard several people say these are separate dimensions, a la Phantom Hourglass or Majora's Mask, to use other examples when they use dimension hopping. So why did he go to the Triforce at the beginning? I've already given my theory in my explanation. I think Link just wanted to, he had done his job, Hyrule was safe, and he couldn't enjoy it. After everything he had been through in LTTP, he had to keep going, he had to keep adventuring, he had to keep saving, and so he was like, no, That's my theory. There's plenty of different possibilities there. There's also, hang on, I'm checking my notes here. They're kind of disjointed because I actually played Ages then Seasons. I didn't mean to actually do that. I'm trying to see if there's anything else lore-wise to talk about. Yeah, there is. Here we go. Okay, down we go. Okay. One of the things I like lore-wise is the implication of the fantasy aspect of things. I know that sounds weird, and I only enjoy this in moderation. I'll admit that freely, because I think too much fantasy just kind of dilutes it. And if you don't know what I mean by fantasy, I don't mean as in the genre. I mean like fantastical. things that are amazing, things that are just beyond the norm, right? Hence the definition. Symmetry City in Oracle of Ages is probably my best example of this in these games. It's a city where everything has to be balanced between the two sides, with regards to people, birth, objects, terrain, all that kind of stuff. And it's the kind of thing that doesn't quite make sense when you think about it, but it's a fantasy element. It's something that just adds to that fantastical mindset. And I feel like this was Capcom trying to take the series into a more fantastical direction, which is funny because then the games as a whole would kind of take that direction, especially when it came to Skyward Sword, for example, in several examples. But I just wanted to comment on that here. I also want to comment on Veron and Onyx. Now, Veron she's practically your typical cackling villain. and honestly, so is Onyx. But both of their plans intrigue me and make me think. Both of them were knowingly trying to light the flames. Whether or not they knew what that would result in is debatable. But I think it is based on their haha, I succeeded at lighting the flame, you are doomed anyways, kind of a thing. So, I guess what I'm trying to lead to here is Ganon is often called, the Demon King or some similar thing, or the King of Evil or Prince of Evil or whatever. He's given several titles, but it's usually some kind of authority figure. I've often felt that partially because of demise, which I have to groan at that, but it's true, partially because of demise and partially because of the raw power that Ganon always had and the focus of darkness that was around him, he literally commanded so many other strong individuals for evil or for darkness or whatever. Remember I mentioned that tribe of evil concept back in LTTP? This is a similar idea, that there are large groups of people who flock to the ideals and to the actual leadership of Ganon. That Veron and Onyx, in other words, this is my theory, genuinely wanted Ganon back. That they felt he was their king and he was their representative. He was the one who deserved to be their king and therefore he should become back. Now, of course, they're getting their own things too. Veron got to cover the land in darkness and Onyx got to destroy things, and both of them had their own fun with that. But you get the idea, right? The presentation of this. This is also present in a few other Zelda games. Zelda 2 comes to mind. I mentioned this all the way back then. I don't even remember how many weeks it's been at this point. When, there's so many creatures, including some fairly large and very powerful creatures who actively are trying to bring Ganon back out of a weird sense of loyalty. I'm reminded of all things of the Exdeath situation over in Final Fantasy V. And it makes me wonder how charismatic Ganon actually is, behind the scenes, so to speak, all the stuff we don't see of him interacting with his minions. And based on the loyalty he engenders, normally I'd say, well, clearly he's actually the kind of guy who actually isn't a stupid evil, but rewards his minions and takes care of them, that kind of thing. I would say that, but then I remember in Ocarina of Time when he flings his phantom into the cleft between dimensions, and then it goes and has adventures with Gilgamesh. And that doesn't sound like the kind of thing that a particularly charismatic or decent leader would do. So I'm not really sure what the hell's up with that. It is also possible that was Ganondorf when he was younger, because it is Ganondorf when he was younger, and ever since then he has both aged and managed to learn the value of leadership. Just food for thought here, but I found it interesting. This also ties into the theme of both games, and this is going to sound weird, but it's also indicative of everything I just mentioned with regards to the Frankenstein concept. In my experience, there are generally two types of themes when it comes to fictional works. Deliberate themes and perceived themes. Let me give you an example of what I mean. I never did a video about this, but there's a movie that just came out called Jurassic World, which is a really good movie. I actually liked it a lot. And as I was watching it, it struck me as odd, the whole, like halfway through the movie until it finally clicked in my mind. And once that one thing clicked, I was like, oh, and it all just kind of fell into place. If I can diverge for a moment, the reasoning being here that Jurassic World felt like it was trying to pull the Godzilla trick. And I got to explain a little bit. Godzilla, the very first Godzilla, which I still consider to be a masterpiece and an excellent example of classic film and classic fiction in general, was a human tale story. It was all about the people. It was all about the impact of what Godzilla was. Godzilla was the impetus. Godzilla was the catalyst. But the story was about the people. The story is about how that affects us. The story was about what that causes to us, right? And that's what made that movie so great. One of the things that made that movie so great, in my opinion, personally. Of course, I'm the Lorerunner, so that's not really probably going to be surprising to you, but you get the idea, right? So it felt like Jurassic World was trying for the same thing, but it was kind of failing because in the Godzilla movie, there was one thing that was tying everything together, one thread, one theme, and I couldn't find the theme in the Jurassic World thing. Well, how does this tie into my talks about this? I read up after the movie, after my revelation of what the theme of Jurassic World is, which, in a nutshell, my perception of this is the theme of Jurassic World is how we deal with things, how we adapt to things, and how we handle things emotionally with a degree of maturity. I would call it growing up, but that really doesn't get across the specific sliver of what I'm going for here. The dichotomy of how different people act and react to the exact same situations, the showcasing of how when things actually get serious and really bad, the person who before was actually strong becomes weak, and therefore the person who becomes weak becomes strong. All this kind of thing, it just speaks to me of that handling of life and how we react to life. Right, that was the theme for me from Jurassic World. Well, after the movie, I went and read up on it and found out the theme was apparently commercialism and excess consumerism and environmentalism and a bunch of other crap that I didn't get at all from the movie. I mean, yeah, in the most threadbare, obvious, duh kind of a way, but that's not a theme at that point. That's like saying the theme of Star Wars is that bad guys are bad. That there's no depth there. But that was that was what the director said, and the someone else, I forget. There were a few people, but several people worked on it. So you see the difference now between a intentional theme and a perceived theme, right? Here's how this ties into the Oracle's games. I'm telling you, I'll tie it back in. It's obvious that the intentional theme was going to be the three things, right? But then that was abandoned, and so we got the game as is with a mixture of those three things. So then I perceived those three themes independently before I even read up on all that stuff in the game. So it's very likely, based on evidence and based on the way the game is projected, that there's no intentional theme at all in the Oracle's games. But because there's so much of the original design philosophy in there which had an intentional theme, I then perceived the original intended theme in the finished product. Which is why I say this is a weird case of thing. But, of course, the theme is obvious, right? All three of those things I just mentioned. Courage, wisdom, power, right? It's even represented in their polar opposites. The flames, flame of destruction for power, flame of despair for courage, and flame of sorrow for wisdom. I know it's not an accurate thing, but if you really think about it, it kind of fits because they're not opposites. That's not the point. Each of those flames is a darker reflection of the existing one, which also kind of ties in to one of the themes that also I feel works throughout the thing, and was also a theme in Link to the Past, which wouldn't surprise me because Link to the Past was apparently a huge inspiration for this game, along with Link's Awakening, and I'll get to that in a minute. And that being the theme of the darker reflections, of, the darker side of things. Destruction is a part of power, but it is a darker side of power. It is one particular aspect of power. Sorrow is an aspect of wisdom. When you have the wisdom to understand what's really going on, you see how you could be sorrowful at such thing? And of course, despair is a side of courage, when you get how this all lines up. So that's my thoughts on the theme, and basically all I've got lore-wise. Let's talk about some other stuff here. I like a few little things. I just jotted down a few notes here. First of all, 400 years in the Ages game, that really bothered me. Why have such a monumental size of time? Now, I've talked about this a billion times, so I don't want to repeat myself too much. I've said it before and I've said it again. Too many writers do not have a sense of scale. And so they write big numbers in terms of distance or how many, quantity or quality or time. Time is a really big one here. Because writers in general just seem to not have a concept of how long 400 years is. That's insane. That's a huge chunk of time. And so, 400 years passing in the from between the past and the present and the Oracle of Ages game is ridiculous. It should have been like 40 years, in all honesty, if that, because there's so many direct connections between the two. Now, I know, in some cases, like the terrain actually shifts, so it makes a little bit of sense. But then in other cases, it makes absolutely no sense because you get the idea. Point being, it kind of bugged me that they just randomly tossed out this huge number over there, but whatever. I do like the reference to Link's Awakening when you are on the raft, when you first get the raft in Ages, and you're sailing around. There's actually a thunderstorm that blows you around, and then lightning strikes the raft, and then you wake up on an island. I thought that was a neat little thing there. This is the second appearance of Tingle, believe it or not. The first one was in Majora's Mask, which a lot of people tend to forget, myself included, that Majora's Mask is actually where Tingle first showed up. Most people tend to remember Tingle most for his appearance in Wind Waker. But personally, I tend to hate him the most in the Four Swords games, but I don't want to talk about that too much here. Suffice it to say, screw Tingle, we all hate him. The they did a couple other nice touches, musical changes based on which season or which area you're in, based on which time frame you're in. Of course, they continued the Link's Awakening thing of different songs for the dungeons. That's going to be the norm, really, from now on. So I'm going to stop mentioning it basically at this point. I talked about that. There's mini games everywhere in both of these games. There's the dancing game in Seasons. There's the running around in the cart game in Ages. There's the trying to prevent the cart from hitting your item while you're trying to repair it game in Ages. There's the Simon Says game. There's lots of those mini games all over the place, and that speaks to the overall intent of the series, which I'm building up to. I really like. How do I put this? I really like the paradox that happens in Ages. You get in the present, you give something. I forget what, but you give something to this Goron. He's like, "Oh, thank you. I will give you this item that is treasured and valued for our people." So you say thanks, and then you go back in time and give that item to the guy and say, "Oh, thank you. I will treasure this into the future." This is a unique thing to think about, and one of the things I love about time travel. That vase was never created, and will exist forever. Think about it from the vase's perspective. I don't know if it's actually a vase, but just pretend it is. Think about it from the vase's perspective. It never at any point in time comes into existence, but it will exist forever. Because anytime it's given to the guy, that Link then warped back and gave it to him, who carried it for the ages, and then Link gave it back, and it just does this. Because the vase never changes. What I find most amusing about this idea is the vase is therefore perceiving these 400 years over and over, not once, but infinitely, basically. And so theoretically, at a certain point in time, the vase would basically reach the point where it stops having cohesion, where it starts to break down and fall apart. And yet at the same time, given the magical aspect of the series, it wouldn't surprise me if the Gorons, like each time, are like, "Oh god, the vase is falling apart, reinforce, reinforce, reinforce." But again, it never entered this cycle. It was always in this cycle. I don't know how better to explain that. Time travel just makes sense in my head, which I don't know how to explain that. So I just thought that was a fun thing to talk about. I already mentioned how this game has a lot of obvious signs of being a proper remake of the old Zeldas. Seasons is probably the best example of that with the first couple of dungeons. And again, what they did with the Dodongo. They added new mechanics to a lot of the standard Zelda 1 styles and concepts and tropes, and that's really cool. But one of the things that I like most, and I said I've been building up to this, so we're going to go ahead and just nail this right in the thing. These games are incredibly inventive for Zelda games. Now this is interesting because so many people complain endlessly about how the Zelda games have never changed. I would disagree with that personally. But then again, I also think the Pokemon games haven't been the same for forever. So you may feel free to flame me for that. It's okay, I get it all the time. But this game, probably I'd say more than any other game except for Phantom Hourglass and possibly Spirit Tracks, innovated the franchise in a great way. I mean, yeah, you go and you get 7 items and then you beat the game. But they did it in a fundamentally different way, and they were very inventive. They could have used the same basic mechanics, same basic gameplay ideas, same basic tool sets in both games, but they didn't. Ages and Seasons have completely different items and different ways those affect each other. My favorite example of this is actually the siege shot thing, which enables you to do all sorts of stuff. Or the switch hook, or the mermaid upgrade. There's lots of different things that add to the gameplay, to the way the game plays, and gives you lots of variety in the dungeons, and in the way you combat, and the way you interact with enemies. But this, of course, leads into my overall point, and probably one of the reasons I like the Oracle's games so much. And this is going to sound weird coming from me. The focus of the Oracle's games is clearly on the gameplay. The story is completely secondary. There's an intro story, and then there's the intro cutscene, and then each time you do a major event, there's a little bit of text to help you get to the next point. But that's like 5% of the game. The other 95% is gameplay, and in this case, it's the puzzles and the combat. And that is a Zelda game in a nutshell, isn't it? And if I could be so bold, this is, in my opinion, one of the better ways to do a proper remake. And I can prove this because this happened over with Square as well, Square Enix. Most of the really good proper remakes that were done over there were not done by Square Enix. They were done by a third-party developer. The Dragon Quests and the Final Fantasies that went on the DS are good examples of this. Those proper remakes were done by a third party who loved the series and had passion for the series and so put their hearts into it. And I feel, I don't have proof of this, but I feel that this Capcom team really loved the Legend of Zelda series and really put their hearts into this. And it shows because they really designed the hell out of these games. Now, this is funny because this could be considered a negative to some people. As I was streaming some of my playthrough of Ages and Seasons both, and one of my viewers, Deutsch, who's an awesome guy, was commenting how he just got fatigued through the game because it's literally just gameplay, 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 gameplay. There's no pause. There's nothing that breaks that up. There's really no, okay, here's the open world exploration thing, like it has been true in LTTP and Ocarina and Twilight and Wind Waker. There's no, here's a ton of story, like Ocarina and Majora's Mask and Wind Waker and Twilight Princess. And, it's just gameplay, 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 gameplay. And the weirdest thing is, I think the best way to describe this is the overworld is another dungeon. I know this is probably going to... I'm sure some of you out there are just going to be like, well, duh. But when this finally clicked in my head, the Oracle's games made so much sense all of a sudden. Because they had always been just off from every other Zelda I've ever played, including Link's Awakening. And I could never really put my finger on why until I realized the overworlds are another dungeon. They are approached in the exact same way, design-wise, that every dungeon in the game is. In a lot of Zeldas, the overworlds are there to give you that exploration feeling, to give you a sense of freedom, which kind of ties into the first point, to give you, wonderful visuals to explore, to enjoy, and to help visually tell the story of the Zelda games, to give you new NPCs to interact with and minigames to do. In the Oracle's games, the overworld exists as a puzzle. You have to think your way around things. It is very specific and very tightly contained, so you can only advance if you think your way through the situation. It is one big puzzle, and filled with plenty of combat, just like the dungeons are. And you have to use those new abilities and new items that you get as you move in order to progress through, just like you would in a dungeon. It's just an extended dungeon. This is true in both games. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing or a good thing. I think it's a good thing, personally. I enjoyed it. But I could see why a lot of people would consider that a negative because it really does, it has that fatiguing effect. It was even having that on me. It's after a while, it's just like, oh my God. Because it's literally, there's no point at which you can just pause and relax or enjoy. It's honestly, okay, how do I go this? And I got to remember this. And okay, I got to go to this. And I got to remember what to do here. And I got to remember what to do over there. Okay, I got this. So now this means I can go over these kind of puzzles. So what can I do with that? Where's the areas I've been trying to remember that can't do that, et cetera, et cetera. So, a good, bad thing, depending on you, depending on your perspective. And I think that's really what defines the Oracle's games and really sets them apart from the rest of the franchise. Now, if I'm not mistaken, that's my last big note. That's the one I was building up to. I love the item design and a lot of the puzzle and dungeon design. I really, really felt this was a very well-designed game in terms of pure gameplay. And if you haven't tried it out, I would recommend it. They're both available on the 3DS Virtual Store for about $6 each. Actually, there is one last thing I want to talk about, and that's the combined mode. This was kind of a cool thing. They left code in both games, the physical cartridges, where if you put in codes, it would change how the game plays to show that you'd played the previous game. So you could play Ages and then Seasons, or Seasons and then Ages, and at the end of the previous game, you get a code which you can punch in, or there's actually several codes you can get, but you get codes you can punch in that will then change how the second game plays. Now, this is all little stuff, really, like the child side quest. It changes how Maple interacts with you a little bit. It changes the animal companion you choose. By the way, the fact that the overworld map will literally change tile sets based on which animal companion you choose, that's another example of really good game design in a nutshell. And of course, once you beat the second game, having beaten the first game, you get access to the third game, which is basically a dungeon and a boss. Dungeon and like 3 bosses. But you go through the final thing and you find out that Ganon has been behind it the whole time. Oh my gosh, what a shock. But I bring this up because I'm curious if you guys think that is a good or a bad thing. Not the combining thing, I think that's a great thing, but I'm talking about the Ganon behind it thing. A lot of people complained that Ganon was in Twilight Princess. And I didn't. I was not in that list because I felt it added to the mythos of the overall series, and it made perfect sense in concept of the overarching story. And I don't think it detracted from Zant, personally, because it made perfect sense with regards to his character arc, too. But I'll talk about all that when we get to Twilight Princess. But here, Ganon really does come out of nowhere, kind of. But the thing is, I think it works here as well because Ganon is not stealing the show. Ganon is incorrectly and improperly resurrected and barely has cohesiveness or function or sanity or anything. He's just a mindless beast. And then you fight the mindless beast and he's like, and we won't see him again until Link Between Worlds, I think, is the next one. But anyways, but Komei and Kotoke, or however the crap you say their names, they were the ones who actually stole the show, so to speak. And it makes a lot of sense to me in a really weird way that they would be, again, manipulating the various people of evil and people of strong power across the various lands of the entire planet in order to combine to bring their king back. One question, how did they come back from the dead? Remember, they died in Ocarina of Time. Remember that? So why are they still here? God knows how many years later. I mean, that was in Ocarina, and then there's a chunk of time, we don't know how long, and then LTTP, and then this game. So it's been a bare minimum of like a century. How are they still here? How are they still functioning? And I don't even have anything for this. I have nothing to go off of. I could just spitball theories off the top of my head. I could also point out that Majora's Mask liked to do the parallel person, so maybe it's the parallel ones who came to this reality and then were possessed by the spirits of the original, and then, I don't know, there's some explanation, I'm sure. It just always struck me as a little bit weird that they did that. Shrug. That's all I got. Good games. Love them. Next time, I think we're working on Minish Cap next, which is also made by that Capcom team, which is why we're doing it next. So, I will see you next time, guys.